And now it's time to get a macro perspective on what else is happening around us in the world. For this morning's World Deconstructor, we're joined by David Tizzard via Zoom. Good morning, David.
Good morning. Great to see you.
Good to see you too. Do you know the banned song list for Sunung, the College Scholastic Ability Test?
Yeah, I know all about them. I was listening to your conversation with Yerika, and thank you for this morning's earworms.
Son of it, right?
I'll tell you one thing, and this is not related to music ability, but I often wake up with songs in my head, and sometimes it's a song that I've never heard before. And one of the reasons I like play music and get it out is because I have something in my head, but I don't know where it came from. And sometimes it's a real song for like 15 years ago, or sometimes it's something I've never heard, but it gets stuck in there.
That's remarkable. I have zero musical talents. I can't even begin to relate. What? Come on. You play the guitar, you're in a band, you're awesome.
Anyway, earworms are real for everybody, I think. Absolutely. So thank you for that latest one. I really enjoyed that. Yeah.
All right, David, take us to Micronesia, because I am willing to bet that most of our listeners, and including myself, are hearing about the islands for the first time.
Micronesia. You know, when I was going down the list of countries, and the next one after Mexico was Micronesia, I stopped and looked, and I actually typed this into Google. Is there a Macronesia? And
it wouldn't make sense.
What? There is.
You're kidding.
It's it's off the coast of North Africa in Europe, in the North Atlantic Ocean. There is a Macronesia. Yes, we're talking about Micronesia. This is in Oceania. Okay. It's in the Pacific Ocean. It became an independent country in 1979. It became a member of the United Nations in 1991. And most of Micronesia now, all these islands collected together, independent states, except for the U.S. Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and Wake Island. So we're in that part of the world, but we're looking at the federal states of Micronesia.
All right. Because there are so many islands to consider and 6 sovereign nations involved in essentially defining this complex set of islands, actually one of the first questions that I typed in was U.S. territory? ? And I got, I guess, yes, partially yes.
Partially, yes. And last week with Juhyun, we discussed the Marshall Islands and Bikini Atoll, about all of the nuclear testing that was done there over sort of a 12-year period, in which they had sort of the equivalent of 1.2 Hiroshima bombs dropped on that part of the world over a 12-year period. So yes, definitely got some American connections there. We're talking about Micronesia, but here's a really interesting thing. There's no such thing as a Micronesian people. So although the notion of Micronesia has existed since 1832, it's been used in popular work, modern culture, it doesn't correspond to a single ethnic group. So where we might have, for example, the United Kingdom with England, Scotland, Wales, and, you know, we have British people, but we don't have Micronesian people in that sense.
All right, but they certainly have Micronesian traditions, for example, some of which we want to examine this morning. For example, how have they preserved their marine system? I want to say the Micronesians, but I guess I can't.
Well, no, I think we can. It's just we can't be 100% technically correct, but I think in popular parlance, it's a perfectly cromulent term that we could possibly get away with. We're talking about how do they preserve their traditions in the face of science. And this is a really interesting question. And for anybody, I really encourage you to go and look at Micronesia, especially what we're looking at is Uliti Atoll. And an atoll is sort of like an island. It has a lagoon or a coral reef around it. And then outside of that, it's just all blue, deep ocean. So you have an island, you have some nice light blue sea, and then boom.
Real
then you
dark.
have the Mariana Trench. That's where it is. And there's people just living there, and they've lived there for thousands of years. But in the last sort of half a century or more, with the arrival of, you know, not just steamboats, but then nuclear weapons and runways and planes and geopolitics, we've had this real clash of, this is the traditional way of life that works. This is modern science. How do we put these two together? All
right. And I wonder if the changing climate puts the country of Micronesia in, well, a more urgent conversation to implement some of the modern technology, some of the science to benefit their islands and their way of life?
Yeah, it is. And I think we're seeing this not just in Micronesia and in the Ulitul Atoll, but in all of our lives, in that religion and taboos and rituals and ceremonies, what was once sort of Christmas or Easter or Ramadan, all of these festivals, they're being sort of turned into sort of more consumerist practices. And the ceremonies are being replaced by data and statistics and graphs and GDPs. And so that's changing, and it is changing for them. On these islands, what we're talking about today, the Ulitul Atoll, right on the edge of the Mariana Trench, you have around 700 to 1,000 people living on these islands. And they've survived for thousands of years in these conditions, not by luck. They've survived by design, and that design is founded in traditional knowledge. They have their belief system, they have their sacred areas. It might not all line up with science, but here's the important thing: it has worked. And that's why, sometimes it doesn't matter how we get to the answer, but as long as we get to the right answer. And here's the important thing: that scientists, they came in with their flashlights, motorboats, spear guns, and this completely disrupted all of the traditional fishing practices that these people had been doing for thousands of years.
But one thing is undeniable: with or without science, a diminished fish source and damage is done to the coral reef. So does that encourage people of Micronesia to also turn to science to look for answers too?
Absolutely. So what happened is, I mentioned sort of flashlights and speedboats and all of these things that we use for fishing. That means we can fish in the dark, and that means we can fish further away. And this disrupts sort of the local ecosystem. It's also the same with us. Now we have lights, we can work in the dark, and we can eat at night.
I don't know how I feel about that.
We lose our circadian rhythms and our biorhythms where we're meant to go with the sun. And so this is really affecting fish numbers. Also, the scientists are saying that when people came in, they came in without understanding the cultural context. They came in with all of this science, all of this information, all of this data with very good intentions, it must be said, but they didn't understand what was happening. I really like this sentence I read from the article. I was looking at Micronesia. They said the scientists came in, but now they want to do this to understand how people who are of a place can lead this process, and how those of us who are not of place but have other resources can support that. So the local inhabitants are of place and they can lead it, but people who are not of place, they have resources that they can use here. So it's about putting those of place and not of place people together.
David, what I'm gathering from our conversation is that there is maybe a discord between those who came in with the modern technology and those who have been doing this a certain way in Micronesia for thousands of years, as you've said. Can they strike a better harmony going forward? Is there such conversation perhaps?
That's exactly what's happening. And I think this reflects a greater understanding from the scientists that are going in. So the sort of old, our way is the right way, or perhaps more old colonialist attitudes of this is the science. Of course, we want to stand behind science and rational thinking and those, but it's also about respecting the local cultures and more importantly, I think, what has worked. It's not just about preserving cultures for the sake of it. If a culture is proven to be disruptive or doesn't work anymore, absolutely it should go. And so now the scientists, they're going in to Micronesia, they're going into the Uletians way of life, and they're trying to do that. And what they're really focusing on there is allowing the fish populations to recover. So the ancestors and the people there, when they were fishing, they would kind of leave this area and they would go over here and fish for a little while and then go over here, and the fish populations would recover. But now with all this data, they're realizing that they've disrupted all of that. And so they're trying to use science. This is very interesting to me. They're trying to use science to go back to more traditional ways, in a sense.
That's very interesting, because science, from what I understand, has helped it become more efficient when it comes to fishing, which has led us to also overfish, which leads to the depopulation you just mentioned. And now we're using the same data to make perhaps wiser decisions, dare I say?
Wiser decisions, yes. And I think it's just imparted by changing Western attitudes as well. You know, we talked about these earworms and we talked about how pop songs have spread around the world. Would Rosé and Bruno Mars's song have gone as popular sort of 20 years ago, even if it was the same song? You're doing it already? Yeah, I like the head movement. But I think Western people have become, not just Western people, I think the wider world has become more open to different cultures, to different ways of life. And so I think this coming together between the people of Micronesia, their traditional ways, and the scientists from other parts of the world is reflecting changing attitudes towards how we see other people and how we respect their ways of life as much as it is the traditional ways of life themselves.
Thank you so much, David. We appreciate it. We'll speak to you again tomorrow.
Thank you.
If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.